When the nurse asked who to contact, I said, "No one." She was a woman in her early 40s with the practical efficiency of someone who had been asking this particular question for years and had received most of the possible answers. She did not react. She wrote in the field. Move to the next line. That was the thing about saying it factually. Nobody quite knew what to do with the absence of distress. The accident was minor by any reasonable classification. I had been struck by a cyclist while crossing Brennan Street on a Wednesday afternoon, the cyclist running a light I had trusted not to be run. I had gone down hard on my left side. 2 cracked ribs, a laceration on my forearm that required 6 stitches, a concussion the attending physician described as mild with mandatory monitoring. Not life-threatening. The word they kept using was stable. I was stable. I lay in the hospital bed in a room with a curtain partition and a window that showed a portion of a building I couldn't identify and answered the nurse's intake questions with the focused monotony of someone filling out a form. Date of birth. I answered. Primary physician? I answered. Emergency contact? I paused for one beat. Not because I didn't know the answer. Because there is something in the body that resists saying a true thing out loud when the true thing is in absence. I don't have one, I said. She looked up from the tablet. Not unkindly. With the specific neutral attention of someone whose job requires them to receive information without editorializing it. Is there family we can contact? No. A friend? Colleague? I thought about Marcus, who was in Vancouver for the month. I thought about the other names in my phone that had accumulated over the years in the way names accumulate, through proximity rather than depth, colleagues and contacts and people I had drinks with at industry events and who would find a hospital call bewildering rather than natural. There's no one I'd want to call for this, I said. She nodded and wrote something. We'll make note. The doctor will be in shortly. She moved on. I lay back against the thin pillow and looked at the curtain partition and listened to the hospital continue around me. The particular ambient sound of a place that does not stop for any individual room, wheels and voices, and somewhere a television set to something nobody was watching. I was 34 years old and I had no emergency contact. This was not a tragedy. I had arrived at it gradually, through a series of decisions and non-decisions and the slow rearrangement of a life that had once had more architecture than it currently did. I was not in the habit of self-pity. I was in the habit of assessment, and the assessment was simply this. The structure I had built for myself had certain gaps in it, and the emergency contact field was one of them. I was thinking about whether I was hungry when I heard footsteps stop outside the partition. Not the brisk functional footsteps of medical staff. A different kind of stop, the stop of someone who has been moving and has encountered something that interrupted the movement. Pause. The kind that has a specific weight to it. Then nothing. The footsteps did not continue immediately. I had not seen Olivia in 14 months. Not by arrangement. Not by anything as deliberate as a decision to avoid. Simply by the organic geography of 2 people who had been close enough to share emergency contacts and had become, through the specific erosion of the last 3 years of their relationship, people who moved through a city the same size without intersection. She had been the first number in my phone for 6 years. The person I called when my father was ill. The person whose voice I wanted when something good happened, not because she would celebrate loudly but because she paid attention in a way that made the thing feel real. The person whose handwriting I recognized before I saw her name on the envelope. The person I had stopped calling when the calls became something she received rather than something she was present for. 14 months since the last conversation. 3 years since anything between us had been easy. I did not know she was in the hospital. I did not know she was working there now. I did not know that the footsteps outside my partition belonged to her until the curtain moved 3 inches and her face appeared in the gap with the expression of someone who has walked into something they did not have time to prepare for. She looked at me. I looked at her. The hospital continued its ambient sound around us. James, she said. Her voice was the same. That was the first thought, immediate and unhelpful. It was completely the same. Olivia, I said. She was in scrubs. Not a nurse's scrubs. The slightly different configuration of someone in a clinical administrative capacity, which was new, which was one of the things 14 months produced in people's lives without your witnessing it. She held the curtain with one hand and looked at me in the hospital bed with the cracked ribs and the stitched arm and the stable status and the form that had no emergency contact written into it. She had heard. I could see it in her face. Every word of it. She did not come in immediately. She held the curtain and looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone deciding something quickly. Then she let the curtain fall and I heard her footsteps move away down the corridor, not in the hurried way of someone escaping but in the specific rhythm of someone who needs 20 feet in 30 seconds to reassemble themselves before returning. She came back in 2 minutes. She came through the curtain properly this time, letting it close behind her, and stood near the foot of the bed with her hands in the pockets of her scrubs in the particular stance of someone who has decided to be present and is still deciding what form the presence should take. "What happened?" she asked. "Cyclist. Running a light?" "Yes." She looked at my arm. "How many stitches?" "6. Ribs?" "2 cracked. Left side." She nodded the way medical people nod when receiving information about an injury, professionally, with the assessment happening behind the expression. "Are you in pain?" "Managed," I said. "They gave me something." "Good." She looked at the window. Then back at me. "You said you had no emergency contact." "I heard you hear it," I said. She looked at the floor briefly. "I wasn't trying to listen. I was walking past." "I know. I'm not accusing you of anything." She looked up. "James?" "Olivia. 3 years ago you had me in that field. 3 years ago things were different." She said nothing. "You know what changed?" I said. She did not answer that, which was its own answer. She looked at the curtain partition for a moment with the expression of someone who has arrived in a conversation through an unexpected entrance and is finding it more open than they expected. I looked at her and let the room do what rooms do when two people sit inside a shared history without trying to move the furniture around. We had been engaged for 8 months. I do not think of it as a failed engagement. I think of it as a clarifying one. The kind that ends with everyone more accurately located than they were before, even when the locating is painful. She told me on a Sunday. We were in the apartment we had been sharing for 14 months, the one with the kitchen window that looked onto a courtyard where someone below us kept a small garden with varying success. I remember the garden was doing well that week. A detail the brain files without permission. She said, "I've been thinking about where we're going." I said, "Tell me." She told me. The language was careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed. Words like trajectory and alignment and where I see myself. Under the careful language, the actual thing. She had been offered a position at a firm in New York, a significant position, the kind that required the word opportunity to be used multiple times in the same sentence. She wanted to take it. She had already decided to take it. She was telling me, not asking me. "I can come," I said. She looked at her hands. "James? I can find something in New York." We agreed when we got engaged that geography was flexible. That's why we chose a long engagement. I know what we said. Then, "I've been talking to Mark," she said. The garden below was doing well. That is the thing I remember. "Talking," I repeated. "He's at the New York office. We've been in contact for a few months. About the position." "About?" She stopped. "About other things." The clarity arrived without drama. "Other things." She looked at me. I looked back at her. "How long?" I asked. "James? I'm not asking to fight about it. I'm asking for an accurate number." She pressed her lips together briefly. 4 months. I sat with that. 4 months of the careful language and the rehearsed conversations and the talking to Mark about other things, all of it running concurrently with the ordinary life we had been conducting in the apartment with the courtyard view and the ring on her finger. "Okay," I said. She blinked. "Okay. I'll call the venue tomorrow. The caterer has a cancellation policy, I'll need to read it again. The invitations haven't gone out yet, so that's manageable." She stared at me. "You're making a list. Someone has to." "You're not going to," she stopped. "James? What would you like me to do?" I asked. Not coldly. Genuinely. She didn't have an answer for that. I think she had expected something different. Had perhaps prepared for it. The version of me that would argue, or plead, or at minimum demonstrate that she had caused significant damage by making a significant choice. Something she could push against. I called the venue the next morning. I signed the cancellation paperwork and sent it by courier. I divided what needed dividing with the fairness of someone who had decided that the only part of this he controlled was his own conduct. I moved the remaining boxes to storage and spent 3 days organizing a new apartment with the focused efficiency of a project that needed completing. She called twice while I was doing it. I answered both times. Both calls were practical. We resolved what needed resolving and I said goodbye at the end of each call with the same tone I used for everything else. She had thought I would beg. I understood this clearly, not from anything she said, but from the specific confusion in her voice across those 2 calls. She had constructed a scenario and I had declined to occupy it. That was, I realized later, the part that had cost her something unexpected. Not my grief. She had prepared for my grief. My composure. That had not been in her preparation. And the thing about composure when someone expects its opposite, is that it lands harder than anything louder could have managed. I did not know that then. I was simply doing the only thing I knew how to do when the ground moved. Staying upright. She came back at 3 in the afternoon. Not in a clinical capacity this time. She was not carrying a tablet or moving with the specific purposefulness of someone between tasks. She came back the way people come back when they have spent 2 hours arguing with themselves and the argument has produced a decision they are not entirely comfortable with. She came through the curtain and sat in the visitor's chair without asking if I wanted company. I was reading something on my phone. I set it down. "You're the financial director," I said. She looked at me. "You figured that out? You're in scrubs but not a clinical uniform. You have an admin access card." The form the nurse completed was cross-referenced to an internal department, and when she came back to check my insurance documentation, she mentioned it had been verified by the director's office. I paused. That moved quickly. Something moved across Olivia's face that was almost a smile. "Not quite. You always did that." "What?" "Read rooms from the details. It's useful." "It was sometimes unnerving," she said. "Accurate but unnerving." She looked at the window. The building I still couldn't identify was still there, doing nothing of note. "I've been here 14 months, she said. "I came back from New York after the first 2 years. The New York position was..." She stopped. "It was what I had expected it to be professionally. It wasn't what I had expected it to be in other ways." "Mark," I said. She looked at her hands. Mark was someone I'd built a version of in my head that was constructed from the distance between us. When the distance closed, the version didn't survive the accuracy. "I'm sorry," I said. Genuinely. She looked at me. "You don't have to be." "I know. I am anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know you were in the city." The admission list just comes through as a standard notification when the director's office needs to flag insurance verification. "I saw your name and she paused. "I stood in my office for a few minutes before I did anything." "What did you do in your office?" "I sat in my chair and I looked at your name on the screen and I thought about what it meant that you were in my hospital without knowing it was my hospital." She looked at the wall. Then the nurse's summary came through. Standard intake notes. Emergency contact listed as none. Yes. And under family, none. Yes. She turned back to look at me directly. "James, you have a sister. Claire lives in Dublin. She has 3 children under 6. A hospital call from London about 2 cracked ribs and a mild concussion would have terrified her for no productive reason. You have Marcus. Vancouver until the end of the month. There are people in your life." "There are people in my life," I agreed. "None of whom I wanted to call from a hospital for something that is going to resolve in 48 hours with rest and anti-inflammatories." She looked at me. "That's not what I mean and you know it." "What do you mean?" She leaned forward slightly in the chair. "You mean it? That's what's..." She stopped. "When the nurse said no one and you confirmed it, you meant it. You weren't being stoic. You weren't protecting anyone from inconvenience. You actually have arrived at a place in your life where your honest answer to that question is no one." I looked at her for a moment. "Olivia. Don't. I'm not going to perform distress to make this easier for you. I'm not asking for distress." "Then what are you asking for?" She sat back. She looked at me in the hospital bed with the directness she had always been capable of when she allowed herself to stop managing the conversation. "I'm asking for the honest version," she said. "Not the one you give the nurse because it's accurate and sufficient. The actual one." I looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The actual version," I said, "is that I have built a life that functions well by most visible measures. I work. I have people I see regularly. I eat well and sleep adequately and the administrative structure of my existence is sound." I paused. "The emergency contact field is a different kind of question. It isn't asking who you know. It's asking who would want to know. And the honest answer to that is that I've spent 14 months not being certain of the list." She looked at me. I looked back. "You don't mean that," she said. Quietly. Not as a challenge. As something that cost her to say. "Which part?" "That there's no one." I held her gaze. "I don't," I said. The room absorbed it. She sat very still. "Then why say it?" "Because it was accurate when I said it," I said. "There is no one I would have called this afternoon. That's different from there being no one in the world who would want to know." She looked at the window. Her hands were in her lap. The left one, the one that had worn a ring for 8 months, was empty in the particular way of something that marks its own previous occupation. "Okay," she said softly. "Just the word." I watched her sit in the chair that was the same distance from my bed as the 6 years between the person she'd been and the one she currently was. I said nothing. The hospital continued around us. And for the first time in 14 months, the silence between us felt like something other than absence. Mark arrived at 4:45. I knew who he was before Olivia said his name because he entered the room with the particular physical vocabulary of someone who has pre-assessed a situation and arrived confident in the assessment. The brief pause at the curtain to take in the room. The selection of a position that placed him between Olivia and the bed. The handshake offered at a specific angle, firm, fractionally longer than necessary. All of it the quiet machinery of someone establishing a reading of the room and their place in it. "James," Olivia said, with the specific tone of someone performing an introduction they had not anticipated preparing. "This is Mark. Mark, this is James." "Mark Ellison," he said. "I've heard a lot about you." "I've heard some about you," I said. He smiled the way people smile when they believe they have an advantage and want you to know they believe it without saying it. He was well-built, well-dressed, the kind of man who wore his professional confidence visibly enough that it functioned as a first impression. He pulled the second chair to a position beside Olivia's with the casual authority of someone accustomed to claiming spaces. "Olivia mentioned the accident," he said. "Cyclist." "Yes." "Unlucky." "Moderately." "How long are they keeping you?" "Tonight and tomorrow morning, pending the concussion protocol." He nodded. "Good hospital for that. I'm in venture development. We've done some work in the healthcare investment space. St. Raphael's has solid clinical governance." "I'm familiar with St. Raphael's," I said. "You've been here before?" "I have some familiarity with the institution." He accepted this and moved on the way people move on when they have offered information and received less than they expected in return. Dr. Anand came in at 5. He was the attending physician, compact, efficient, with the manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to be unimpressed by most things and selectively warm about the ones that earned it. He reviewed the monitoring data, checked my responses, asked me 3 questions about the concussion symptoms with the focused precision of someone who actually wanted the answers rather than confirming the expected ones. Then he looked at the tablet in his hand and added, with the mild tone of someone noting something incidental, "Your office called earlier about the discharge paperwork routing." I wasn't aware of the Callaway Group's involvement with our trust board until the administrator flagged it. Mark's head moved slightly. The involuntary micro-adjustment of someone whose attention has been redirected. "I should have mentioned it when I came in," I said. "I didn't want to complicate the intake." "Not a complication at all," Dr. Anand said. "The trust board has been a significant factor in the new cardiology wing. The administrator wanted to make sure your care experience was properly attended to." He made a note on the tablet. "I'll have the discharge instructions prepared for the morning." He left. The room was quiet. Mark looked at me with the expression of someone whose initial assessment had encountered a variable it had not accounted for. "Callaway Group," he said. "Yes." "Healthcare investment?" "Among other sectors." He processed this with the specific efficiency of a man in venture development who understood what a trust board position at a hospital like St. Raphael's represented in real terms. "I wasn't aware you were in that space," Olivia said. She said it carefully. Not with the guilt of someone who had been caught being wrong. With the specific care of someone navigating new information in a room where the navigation was visible. "It's not something I talk about generally," I said. "How long?" "The healthcare portfolio started about 2 years ago. The St. Raphael's trust position came through 18 months back." She looked at the window. I did not perform anything for her to look at. I lay in the hospital bed with the cracked ribs and the stitched arm and said what was accurate and let the accuracy be sufficient. The Callaway Group was not something I had built for an audience. I had built it during the specific period that follows a significant loss when the alternative to building is simply continuing to sustain damage. 3 years of quiet accumulation, the kind that does not announce itself, that does not require external validation at each stage, that compounds in the background of an ordinary-looking life until one day the background is larger than the foreground anyone was watching. Olivia had left a man she had decided was insufficiently ambitious. She had made a reasonable assessment based on available evidence. She had not known what I was doing with the time she was not watching. Mark said, "We should talk sometime. The healthcare space is somewhere our fund is looking to expand. Send me something through the office," I said. "My assistant can set up a call." He nodded with the professional grace of someone incorporating a recalibrated situation. He was good at that. I could see why Olivia had been drawn to him in New York, The specific easy confidence of a man who recovered quickly and never let recalibration become visible distress. The difference between us was not the confidence. It was what the confidence was built on. His was constructed for rooms. For the immediate register of other people's assessment. He moved through spaces and read them and positioned himself, and it worked because he was good at it and because most rooms rewarded it. Mine was built in private. In the 18 months after the courtyard apartment and the cancellation paperwork and the 2 phone calls that resolved what needed resolving. In the specific silence of someone who had stopped requiring external confirmation that the work was real. Olivia was looking at me when I came back to the room from wherever I had been in my own head. Her expression was the specific one I had not seen in 6 years. The one she used when she was looking at something she had not expected. She looked away before I could define it more precisely. Mark said something about dinner reservations and stood to leave. She stood with him. At the curtain she turned back once. She didn't say anything. She just looked. I didn't say anything either. The curtain fell. I lay back against the thin pillow and looked at the window and thought about the building I still couldn't identify. Tomorrow I would ask someone what it was. It seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing. She watched me leave from the corridor window on the 2nd floor. I did not know this at the time. I found out later, which meant I did not perform the leaving for an audience. I simply left, which made the observation, I think, more useful to her than anything I could have staged. The discharge was at 9:40 on a Thursday morning. Dr. Anand signed off with the brisk efficiency of a man satisfied by accurate data. Patricia from administration brought the paperwork, treated me with the specific professional warmth reserved for trust board members without making it conspicuous, and wished me a careful recovery. I collected my jacket, which had been hung on the back of the door by someone during the first hours of admission, still with the slight stiffness of a garment that had been on the ground on Brennan Street the previous afternoon. I put it on. I walked out. No one carried my bag because there was no bag. No one held the elevator because I pressed the button myself. No one met me in the lobby with a car because I had arranged a car through my phone while the discharge paperwork was being finalized. The lobby was the ordinary lobby of a hospital on a Thursday morning. People in various stages of arriving and leaving, the particular mixture of relief and worry that hospitals produce in the people moving through them. A child near the entrance was being zipped into a coat by a grandmother who was doing it wrong, and the child was tolerating it with magnificent patience. I walked through the lobby and through the main doors and got into the car that was waiting. The driver said, "Good morning, Mr. Calloway." "Morning," I said. We drove. Olivia had come in at 8:30 for the first of 2 morning meetings. The 2nd floor corridor ran past the window that looked down at the patient discharge area at the side of the building. She had not gone there deliberately. She had been walking between meeting rooms with coffee and a folder and had looked out the window at the moment I emerged from the side exit. She told me this later, in stages, in the specific way of someone who releases information as they arrive at the courage for each piece. She said she had stopped walking. That she had stood at the window and watched me cross the discharge area to the waiting car. That I had not looked up. That I had not paused or searched the building's face for anyone who might be watching. That I had simply moved from the door to the car with the unhurried steadiness of a man completing a simple task. She said it was the no drama that did it. She had experience of drama. Mark, in his way, was dramatic, the specific type of drama that belongs to men who are accustomed to occupying the emotional center of rooms and become destabilizing when they are not there. She had come to understand this over 14 months, not through a single event but through the accumulation of small ones. The way he responded to professional setbacks by requiring reassurance from the nearest available person. The way he tracked her attention in social situations with the subtle insistence of someone who needed to be the primary focus. The way warmth was offered at full volume when everything was functioning and withdrawn with equal efficiency when it was not. She had left James for Mark and arrived at Mark and found the interior of the choice different from the exterior. This was not, she understood clearly, James's problem or James's narrative. She had made the choice she had made for the reasons she had them. The fact that the outcome was different from the projection was information about her projection, not a claim against anyone else. But she stood at the corridor window and watched me get into a car on a Thursday morning and felt something she could not immediately name. It arrived in parts. First, the absence of what she had expected. She had expected, even after the previous afternoon's conversation, some residue of the version of James she had maintained in her memory for 6 years. The one who had signed cancellation paperwork quietly and she had read as insufficient. The one whose composure she had experienced as passivity because she had not yet understood the difference. Second, the rereading of that memory with current information. He had not been passive. He had been the opposite of passive. He had looked at a situation that had been designed, consciously or not, to produce a particular emotional response from him, and he had declined to produce it. He had managed the cancellation, managed the transition, managed the following 6 years, and had built something significant in the background of a life she had decided was not going anywhere. Third, the specific arithmetic of what she had left and what she had moved toward. Not a comparison. Comparisons required a competition, and there was no competition. James had not competed then and was not competing now. Which was, she understood standing at the window, the entire point. She had left a quiet man thinking the quiet was the problem. She had spent 6 years discovering it was the thing she missed most. The car turned at the end of the discharge lane and moved into the morning traffic. I did not look back. She watched until I was gone. Then she went to her meeting. She found me on a Friday. Not inside the hospital. I had returned for a follow-up appointment, the concussion protocol requiring a 24-hour check before full clearance. It was brief. Dr. Anand reviewed my responses, confirmed the symptoms were resolving correctly, signed the clearance form with the efficiency of a man whose morning was scheduled tightly. I was outside by 10:15, standing on the pavement at the building's side entrance while the car was being brought around. The morning was the clean, cold kind that November occasionally produces, the kind where the light is sharp enough to make edges visible that softer weather obscures. I heard her before I saw her. The specific sound of heels moving faster than heels are usually moved when their owner is trying to maintain composure while abandoning it. James? I turned. Olivia was in her coat, the practical one, not the elegant one she wore to things that required elegance. She had come out of the building without apparent planning. The folder she was holding was closed, but she had not been to a meeting with it. It was a prop she had picked up on the way out because people carry things when they leave buildings in a hurry and need to look like they had a reason. She had been crying. Not extensively. Recently. The specific evidence of it, the slightly reddened edges of her eyes, the controlled breathing of someone who has finished the crying but is still managing the aftermath. She stopped 2 feet from me. I was going to let you leave, she said. What changed? I got to the elevator. She looked at the pavement briefly. I stood there and I thought, if I let you leave again without saying the actual thing, I'm going to spend another 6 years not having said it. What's the actual thing? She looked at me. Why didn't you fight for me? She asked. The question had been waiting in the room since Wednesday afternoon. Since the curtain and the no emergency contact and the conversation in the visitor's chair. I had felt it there, not as an accusation but as a genuine inquiry, the kind that comes from someone trying to understand the architecture of their own history. I looked at her. Because love isn't a competition, I said. She pressed her lips together once. I need more than that. When you told me about Mark, I said, you had already decided. The decision was complete before the conversation. I could have argued. I could have presented a case. I could have said all the things that make a person feel temporarily uncertain and then come back to their decision 3 weeks later anyway. I paused. That wouldn't have been fighting for you. That would have been fighting for the idea of you, to avoid having to adjust to the loss of you. How do you know I wouldn't have changed my mind? I don't, I said. I never will. But I know that a love that requires someone to be persuaded back into choosing you is a different thing from a love that chose you without persuasion. She looked at me. I wanted you to try, she said. I know. I thought, she stopped, started again. I thought if you didn't try, it meant I wasn't worth trying for. I looked at her with the specific steadiness of someone who has spent 6 years arriving at an honest view of something and is now delivering it. You were worth everything I had, I said. The not fighting wasn't about your worth. It was about my dignity. I wasn't willing to compete for a position in your life that you had already decided to give someone else. She looked at the pavement. I made a mistake, she said. The words arrived simply without staging. The 3-word sentence that does a specific kind of work when the person saying it has genuinely earned the right to say it through understanding rather than convenience. I let it sit for a moment. No, I said. She looked up. You made a decision, I said. You made it with the information you had and the values you held at the time. You decided I wasn't what you needed. You were wrong about what I was, but the decision itself came from somewhere real. That's not. A mistake is something that happens without intention. What you did was considered. You weighed things and chose. The outcome was different from what you projected, but that doesn't retroactively make it a mistake. It makes it a decision with consequences you didn't anticipate. She was quiet. I need you to understand the difference, I said, because the mistake frame lets you feel bad in a way that is still centered on your experience of the situation. The decision frame is more honest. She looked at me. You're not angry. No. You should be. Why? Because I hurt you. Yes, I said. You did. And you're not. She stopped. I processed the hurt a long time ago, I said. In the specific way you process things when you have nothing else to do with them. It took longer than I would have preferred. It produced a period that was not particularly pleasant. And then it produced something else. What? I looked at the building across the street, the one I had finally identified during the discharge, a private residential block that had been converted from a Victorian warehouse. Clarity, I said. About what I wanted. About what I was building. About the kind of person I was in the absence of trying to be the kind of person someone else needed. She wiped the edge of one eye with the efficiency of someone who does not like being seen doing it. What do you do with that? She asked. The clarity. You build with it, I said. The car arrived at the curb. I looked at her. She looked at me. Nothing had been resolved in the way of a resolution. No promises, no returns, no tidy repositioning of two people back to where they had been before the choice that changed the geography. But something had been said that was true. And that, in my experience, was the only place anything real could begin. Take care of yourself, Olivia, I said. She nodded once. I got in the car. I did not look back. But for the first time in 6 years, not looking back was a choice, not a habit. That distinction, small and private and entirely mine, was more than enough. The board meeting was on a Thursday in April. St. Raphael's quarterly trust meeting, held in the fourth-floor conference room with the long table that seated 12 and the window that looked across the city toward the river. I had attended 3 previous meetings by video link during my recovery period and had returned to in-person attendance at the recommendation of nobody in particular and the decision of my own preference for rooms over screens. I arrived at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock start. The administrative coordinator, a composed woman named Frances who managed the meeting logistics with the kind of invisible efficiency that makes institutions appear to run themselves, offered coffee and directed me to my customary position at the table. I took my seat. At 9:58 Olivia entered. In her capacity as financial director, she attended the quarterly meetings to present departmental budget performance and capital expenditure updates. I had known this when I accepted the meeting invitation. She had known I was on the trust board since the day Dr. Anand mentioned it in the hospital room. We had arrived at this particular Thursday through the accumulated small decisions that bring two people into the same institutional room without either of them having chosen the other's presence specifically. She saw me when she came through the door. A pause of approximately 1 second that would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. Then she moved to her position at the table, 3 seats and a corner from mine, and opened her laptop and looked at the screen with the focused attention of someone whose morning has produced information they are processing while performing normalcy. I poured coffee. Daniel Ash, the trust chairman, arrived at 10 and called the meeting to order with the particular efficiency of a man who believed punctuality was a form of respect and had therefore never experienced its opposite without visible irritation. The meeting ran its course. Budget reports, capital expenditure review, clinical governance updates, a proposal for the new imaging equipment that had been under consideration for 2 quarters. Olivia presented the financial section with the smooth competence of someone who knew the material completely and had delivered versions of this presentation enough times to have removed all uncertainty from its execution. She did not look at me during it. Once, near the end of the expenditure summary, she looked up from the screen to address a question from the clinical director and her eyes moved fractionally toward my side of the table and then away, quickly, the practiced non-glance of someone managing in awareness. I looked at my copy of the budget document and made a note. Afterward, in the corridor, Daniel fell into step beside me. He was 63, a former surgeon turned administrator, with the blunt warmth of someone who had decided at some point in his 50s that life was too compressed for indirectness. Good to have you in the room rather than a screen, he said. Better from this side too. How's the recovery? Complete, functionally. The ribs announce themselves occasionally in cold weather. They'll do that for a while. He looked at the corridor ahead. I heard you had a rough stay. No contact on file. It resolved efficiently. He looked at me sideways. No family in London? I have people, I said. They were elsewhere. He considered this with the patient lack of judgment of someone who had seen enough human arrangements to understand that most of them were more complicated than their surfaces suggested. Do you regret anything? He asked. Not about the hospital specifically. In the way of someone asking a larger question through a smaller door. I thought about it honestly. About a Sunday in an apartment with a courtyard view. About cancellation paperwork signed at a kitchen table. About a hospital admission form with a blank in the emergency contact field. About a corridor window on the second floor and a car turning at the end of a discharge lane. Only that I once thought love required permission, I said. Daniel looked at me. That's a very precise regret. It was a very specific lesson. We reached the elevator. He pressed the button and we waited in the companionable silence of people who have said enough. Olivia was engaged to Mark. I knew because Francis mentioned it in passing while distributing meeting materials, the way people mention things they assume are known. The ring was visible at the table. Small, correct, chosen with the taste of a man who understood how things should look. She had moved toward what she could see. She had always been more comfortable with the visible. I did not judge this. I understood it. At the hospital, when the nurse asked who to contact, I said no one. Because the honest answer to that question is not about who exists. It is about who stays. Family isn't who stands beside you in ordinary time. It is who remains when you fall. She had already walked away. I had not lost anything that was mine to keep. I understood that now. The elevator came. I stepped in. The doors closed. And I rose as I always did, quietly. Entirely on my own terms.